by the Washington Report for Middle East Affairs, the publication that, of course, is sponsoring this event. I'm the president of the International Council for Middle East Studies, but I'm appearing here in my individual capacity. Although I have encountered much controversy and antagonism in dealing for nearly 6 decades with the Arab-Israeli, mainly Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as an historian, writer, speaker, and activist, what I have experienced in the past couple weeks after accepting the invitation to interview Gilad Atzmon is extraordinary. I have received tens of emails and telephone calls from friends and strangers beseeching me not to do this interview. 2 of my closest friends, one a Palestinian and one an Israeli Jew, with whom I share many, if not all, of the opinions on the issues of the conflict, were on the verge of cutting off their friendship with me. Fortunately, they recanted. This antagonism saddened me, especially in regard to my friends, but it also motivated me even more to interview Gilad. The 2 statements, which have been distributed to all of you, underline and emphasize the issues involved in my beginning remarks. One statement is signed by political writers and activists disavowing Gilad Atzmon and what they allege are his anti-Semitic and racist views. The other statement is Gilad Atzmon's response and refutation. They are worth reading. Both statements mention democracy. I need not remind you that in any real democracy, freedom of expression is a cardinal principle. That Gilad Atzmon is also a world-class musician and one of the top jazz saxophone players added another dimension to my desire to meet him. So here we are. I have read and seriously considered Gilad Atzmon's book. I have read articles by and about him and have listened to numerous of his interviews. Hopefully then, I am prepared to attempt to provoke a spirited interview discussion. I have no doubt that Gilad will be spirited. I assume that many of you in this audience know Gilad Atzmon's general positions pertaining to the Jewish state and the Palestinians, which provides a major part of the contextual framework for the discussion in his book, The Wandering Who. Nevertheless, and for those of you who may not be so aware of this, I shall first ask Gilad to state briefly his position on this point. 2, I shall next ask Gilad to comment, again briefly, upon the 2 major and extreme allegations made against him by his antagonists. 3, we shall then proceed to my questioning Gilad about Jewish identity and Jewish identity politics, the subtitle of his book. Let us now go to your analysis of Jewish identity and what you term as Jewish identity politics. I have more to ask you about this than we possibly have time for in one interview, but we shall do as much as possible. You do not hesitate to generalize about Jews and the history of the Jews. You do this regarding Jews as a whole and regarding Jews in various specific groupings. How do you respond to the suggestion that you overgeneralize? In this regard, I'm suggesting, for example, that citing negative qualities of large numbers of Jews by noting a few outstanding individuals who happen to be, or happen to be Jews or happen to be Jewish, regardless of their positions regarding Zionism and the state of Israel, is to overgeneralize from the point of view of many people, and perhaps to do so dangerously, especially when you emphasize the term tribalism as the contextual framework here. I am questioning your empirical evidence for such generalizations, and I'm especially raising this question in regard to the recent past centuries since the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
In your book you write that Zionism is largely a Jewish diaspora discourse. You maintain that Zionism is of little concern to Israelis, at least to Israeli Jews themselves. Yet, You also criticize and condemn the Zionism of Israel's character, as I call it, and its manifestations, which not only affect but oppress the indigenous Palestinian population. You actually specify much of this in your book. You also state near the end of your book that the state of Israel needs to be de-Zionized, a term, by the way, coined by the late American Reform anti-Zionist Rabbi Elmer Berger, about whom I shall refer a bit later in this interview. How do you reconcile these seemingly opposite positions? I now want to focus upon your criticism of anti-Zionism and anti-Zionists. In your book, you denigrated most, if not all, expressions labeled by their advocates as anti-Zionism. You wrote, I'm quoting, "Fundamentally, Jewish anti-Zionism is still just another form of Jewish tribal supremacy," end quote. I understand that you direct this criticism mostly to those individuals who group themselves together as Jews against Zionism or Jewish anti-Zionists. This, I suggest, is at least a problematic consideration. I am thinking, first of all, about Elmer Berger, whom I mentioned before, one of the major influences upon me, and the American Council for Judaism, the anti-Zionist Jewish organization of which he was the ideologue and main person from the mid-1940s until 1968, when he organized another group, Jewish Alternatives to Zionism, which he headed until his death in the mid-1990s. As a footnote here, I might say that I, with Elmer Berger, was the executive director of the American Council for Judaism in 1967, and I was the colleague and associate of Berger in his next group, American Jewish Alternatives to Zionism. Berger and the individuals who were in those avowed Jewish those people in there were avowed Jewish anti-Zionists. So my question is, were Elmer Berger and his associates and followers, in your opinion, motivated by and or manifestations of Jewish tribalism? Individuals who have referred to themselves as Jews and certainly as anti-Zionists. The first is the late Israel Shachak. You begin your book with a quotation of Shachak, and I know that you respect him greatly. Shachak worked closely with Elmer Berger for some years. Actually, I introduced the two of them. Among his many writings, Israel Shachak wrote a brilliant essay titled Zionism as a Recidivative Movement in a book titled Anti-Zionism, Analytical Reflections, edited by Samir Rabo, a Palestinian friend of yours, yeah, Roselle Techner, and myself. The book was a dedication to Elmer Berger. In addition to working with Berger and with his group, American Jewish Alternatives to Zionism, Shachak was certainly a secularist for most of his adult life, a severe critic of traditional Judaism, an advocate of prophetic Judaism, a sophisticated scholar of the history of the Jews, and a lover of many aspects of what could be called Jewishness, especially in the post-Enlightenment time period. How does he fit into your analysis of Jewish history? And then there is Norton Mezvinsky. I grew up in an American Orthodox Jewish family in Ames, Iowa. I was the only Jew in the schools I attended until my junior year of high school. My best friends, to coin a phrase, were non-Jews. I studied Judaism with a private teacher until I went to the university and continued such study with distinguished Judaic scholars. Influenced to a great extent by Elmer Berger when I was a university undergraduate, and even more by increased knowledge of what Israel had done and was doing to Palestinians, I turned against Zionism. And I've been an avowed opponent of Zionism for well over half a century. Spinoza is my favorite philosopher. I belong to and attend weekly, I attend weekly a Lubavitch Hasidic congregation in New York City. Even though I do not accept a number of the theological and Zionist supportive positions of the Lubavitcher grouping, I feel most at home in that kind of congregation. My closest friends and associates include Jews and non-Jews, and a number of Palestinians. How do I fit in to your concept of Jewish identity politics? And I ask this because I do not necessarily consider myself exceptional. In chapter 17 of your book, you praise Shlomo Sand's recent book, The Invention of the Jewish People. Sand raises doubt, in fact he politically negates the idea, that Jews ever existed as a nation or race, or even shared a common origin. The idea of a people, Sand argues, occurred late, probably, he says, in the 19th century, and is an invalid, made-up notion. Sand denies the Jewish exile and tries to substantiate the Khazars argument put by Arthur Kessler in his book, The 13th Tribe. I suggest that you might praise Sand a bit too much. What Sand argues is mostly, this is my version, a warmed over but well put argument made by others in the late 19th and early 20th century. Moreover, you do not mention in your book the historical works and Jewish sources that belie, at least in part, Sand's arguments. No reputable historian of the Jewish national movement, anyway, to my knowledge, has ever believed that the origins of Jews are ethnically and biologically pure. Neither Sand nor you, Gilad, mention central positions and the documentation thereof of many points. Neither of you mention, at least as I can determine, let alone refute substantively, that from 2000 onward, for example, a team of scholars from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem came out with the production of a large 3-volume study on the history of the Jews of Russia that tends to disprove much of the Khazar theory. There is, moreover, evidence that has been published about the Jews' exile from the Jerusalem area. And these are but 2 examples. Israel Bartal, the dean of the humanities faculty at the Hebrew University, was the author of the book, Cossack and Bedouin Land and People in Jewish Nationalism, wrote a devastating response with a good deal of historic source references about the Sholem Sand book that was published in Haaretz in July of 2008. Other good historians have written negative reviews as well of the book, in which they have pointed to evidence from historical sources. Scholarly scientific articles, moreover, written by a number of scholars from outstanding medical schools in the United States mostly, and based upon studies of blood groups and semen markers, have noted in articles published in leading scientific journals some, I underline some, similarities in Jewish group genetics. You may, of course, disagree, and I may disagree, with what has been published that contradicts Sand, but I'm asking you, would it not have been the thing to do to mention the historical and genetic studies? By not mentioning those studies, you may leave the impression that there is nothing to provide some doubt, I happen to think some serious doubt, to what you point out Sand wrote. Could this also not be considered to be misleading? Fair enough. Now for my final question. I wish to ask you to explain briefly why you say you have been so motivated by what Otto Weininger wrote in his 1903 and only book, Sex and Character. As outrageous as you state he was, nevertheless, you say he was a kind of motivating hero for you. I must tell you, that surprises me. As some of you in the audience may know, Weininger was a follower of some early psychoanalytic thought with philosophical leanings towards Jung and Romanticism. Like others in the late 19th and early 20th century, Weininger believed that homosexuality and Jewishness were symptoms of society, unable to cope with his life, and unwilling to envisage what I'll call alternative ways of understanding those things that he thought he had inside of him, homosexuality, and also a Jew who then converted to Christianity. Weininger then chose to, well, he converted, as I said, and he chose to commit suicide at age 23, and he only wrote that one book. Now again, it surprises me that he motivated you, but I'd like to be able to understand why more than I do. All right, well, as I said when we started, there's much more that we could talk about, but I think we got into at least some of the issues of Jewish identity and Jewish identity politics, and I think that also, Gilad, you gave the audience a good explanation of your position, which is certainly, I must say, a position, from my point of view, quite different and almost the opposite of what your most extreme antagonists have said about you. So let's thank Gilad Atzmon for his explanations and answers in the interview. Gilad Atzmon, the musician.